tuned in to the Andrew Lawton Show.
But I want to shift gears here very dramatically for a moment. It is Monday. We'll talk in a few minutes to a few seconds really, to our good friend Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. But just to set the stage here, you remember when the Federal Court of Canada found that Justin Trudeau had violated your and my constitutional rights when they invoked the Emergencies Act and used it to trample on civil liberties? Well, that lawsuit they spent $2.2 million on in legal fees. And by the way, tip of the iceberg, the appeal is ongoing, but $2.2 million only to be told by a federal court judge, that was not constitutional. Kris Sims, always good to talk to you. Thanks for coming back on today.
Thanks for having us.
So $2.2 million. I mean, in terms of the broader Canadian budget, this isn't the hugest amount, but it's about priorities. Instead of a government showing contrition and saying, yeah, you know what, we probably shouldn't have done that, they fought it tooth and nail and even now are continuing to fight it.
Yeah, and it's one of those things, again, that shows just how out of touch government can get when they're in power for so long. And so, to your point, it was a federal court judge that made what I would consider a pretty landmark ruling. I'm not a lawyer, but a lot of my lawyer friends are calling it that. When the justice decided, the invocation of the Emergencies Act, that included things like freezing the bank accounts of people who were supporting the protesters who were in Ottawa at the time, was unconstitutional. You can't do that. So definitely hats off to our friends and colleagues over the Canadian Constitution Foundation. I know you've spoken with them many times, Andrew, on your show. And so that was a really key ruling. And I think a lot of people are now writing that down as precedent going forward. And so it would be a good idea for the government to kind of read the room. You know, it's no longer 2021, the heat has come down out of this kind of witch hunt era, as the CCF would have put it at the time, during the pandemic and during the lockdowns. And now it's probably a good idea for the federal government to kind of look around and say, you know what, is this really in the best interest of the public for us to continuously fight this after someone as high level as a federal judge has said, yeah, you guys crossed the line here, better back off. And as my colleague Franco Terrazzano said, the federal director of the CTF, they should really back down off of this. They shouldn't spend one penny more of taxpayers' money. And if the government does want to say something, they could probably start with an apology.
Yeah, and this is the thing, and we saw in Alberta, your province, this happen when Danielle Smith took over. She issued an apology on behalf of the Alberta government to unvaccinated people in the province who had been subjected under the previous government by Jason Kenney to some very significant restrictions, which were common across the country, but didn't actually have any sort of contrition or acknowledgement of wrongdoing from the governments. And there are some people who would say, of course, too little, too late. But I would also point out here that it was something, and she certainly hasn't spent time fighting these people in court. And that's the great thing, is that the government right now federally says on one hand, oh yeah, we want to move on from this, but they're still trying to defend the indefensible here, which is saying and spending, again, millions of dollars in taxpayer money to defend their right to freeze your bank account.
Exactly. And going on with an appeal to this ruling is not moving on. That is continuously spending taxpayers' money. And I think we need to really put a frame around this on what happened when they froze those bank accounts. So not getting into the details about, yay truck or whatever, but when you look at it, according to police, this was a peaceful protest. People were expressing themselves. And then they used this draconian sort of law, this Emergencies Act, which according to the government and according to legal experts, is only supposed to be used in extreme emergencies, thus the term. And so, putting it in a nutshell, what the judge said, and I'm paraphrasing, is protest isn't an emergency. We are not being invaded, God forbid. Aliens are not coming down out of the sky. We are not suffering a massive terrorist attack, again, God forbid. That is what the Emergencies Act is supposed to be. And yet they went and did it anyway. And so that is why the Taxpayers Federation said, if you suspend civil liberties, if you invoke something that used to be called the War Measures Act, it's pretty difficult for grassroots citizens organizations to hold government to account. And when you put that into the context of, remember, a couple of years before that, they tried sneaking through this little rule that they'd be allowed to spend without any government oversight at all.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was pretty wild. And now you add on how much this is costing taxpayers for things like the lockdowns. Also, one could argue that the Trudeau government printed hundreds of billions of dollars out of thin air during that entire situation. So that has helped with the inflation crisis, as my friend again, Franco Terrazzano, would point out. So we're still financially feeling the results of this. Probably a good idea for the government to put down the credit card and start moving on from this in their true nature. Because keep in mind, like, we don't have money for this. The government does not have money for this. Number one, it does not create wealth. Every nickel of this is taxpayers' money. Number two, we are so far in debt, Andrew. We are $1 trillion in debt. The Trudeau government has nearly doubled it during its time in office. Like, we have unmoney. All of this would be borrowed money to continuously fight this thing.
Yeah, very well said. And I think it's a natural segue into the story I talked about a bit last week, but there's a bit of an update to it in that CBC is getting in the federal budget another $42 million in addition to the $1.4 billion, in addition to all of the money they've gotten over the years, plus ad revenue, which I imagine is like, $4 given their viewership numbers. But still, some people pay for advertising on CBC inexplicably. And here we have a government that is giving more money to the state broadcaster. Well, the state broadcaster gives millions of dollars in executive bonuses, and its president doesn't even want to be interviewed by CBC journalists. This is a tweet from Travis Danraj. Now, Travis Danraj is the guy who, at the beginning of COVID, flew to Rio and then got realized it made him look really bad when he was writing about why everyone else needs to stay home, so he flew back. But Travis Danraj, he says, at a time when the public broadcaster is under increasing scrutiny and when transparency is needed, Canada Tonight requested an interview with Catherine Tate. We wanted to discuss new budget funding, what it means for jobs, and the corporation's strategic priorities ahead. Our request was declined. This is unfortunate. Now, I don't begrudge anyone turning down an interview request from Travis Danraj. They have that right. That is something you can do. But when the CBC president doesn't even want to be interviewed by CBC, why the heck are the rest of us supposed to take them seriously?
I'm just so glad this happened because it's so funny.
Yeah.
Right? And so I think here, this me putting my thinking cap. So full disclosure, I did work at the CBCs for a very short period of time. They were very nice to me. I hold no personal grudges whatsoever. But I remember working in the newsroom in Ottawa, and I'm just for the life of me trying to figure out how this went. Like, how many different layers of comm specialists and assistants and producers this request would have had to go through. And I think the reason why CEO of the CBC, Catherine Tate, who, by the way, is paid between $400-something thousand and $600-something thousand per year, with bonuses included, how it is that she denied this request, I think it goes back to that national interview. That anchor, she used to be a field reporter for a long time, Adrienne Arsenault, but she's now an anchor of the National, in case people don't know. She had CEO Catherine Tate on, and this was just before Christmas.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, we all remember the story of, oh, this is going to cause hundreds of layoffs before Christmas, these big cuts. And so she went after Tate, saying, oh, well, the Canadian Taxpayers Federation has found that we're spending between $14 and $15 million on bonuses. Are you at least going to cut out the gravy and the bonuses this year? And Tate was lost for an answer. It was like a deer stuck on the railroad tracks. And so I have a feeling that
I feel you've mixed your metaphors there. A deer in the headlights became a deer. What sort of sadistic railroad track bondage dungeon are you running over there in Lethbridge?
Well, you know what it's like at night when the train is coming and it's got that big spotlight, and now I've just added deer to it. So okay. Yeah, I guess
now you've done like a deer trolley dilemma. We're going back to first year philosophy here. A deer is tied down on the railroad tracks and it's paralyzed with fear. But anyway, the long story, I don't blame Catherine Tate for not wanting to return to CBC. That is fair.
Yes. And the main thing here, though, is, again, they're constantly crying poor, and the Trudeau government just gave them another $42 million. And again, trust in media, in mainstream media, to be clear, is just nosediving right now. And that's largely because the government is paying so many journalists. Mm-hmm. You can't hold the government to account if you're counting on the government for your paycheck. And here they just went and gave them a big dollop more.
I'm kind of the mind that CBC should basically just fire everyone but those French journalists that did the investigation of the transgender youth clinic. They're like the ones there that are doing real journalism, and then get rid of everyone else. But this would I would be remiss to point out that it is Earth Day today, which I didn't realize. It's kind of lost its shine. Like Earth Hour, I couldn't even tell you when it is. I remember when Earth Hour was a thing, and everyone was really excited about it, and now no one cares. Earth Day, I remember when I was a kid in school, which is going back more than I'd care to admit now. This was a thing for a little while. But Earth Day is apparently today. Stephen Guilbeault commemorated it by announcing a federal plastics registry, which I'll be talking about in a couple of minutes on the show. But you decided to share a video clip from, this is a deep cut from the archives. Anything you want to say before we play it?
I just wanted to note that this was just a few days after we launched from TV station. Enjoy.
Yeah, this is an old Sun News gem, which sadly the archives have been lost to history for the most part. Well, you got a few gems. I played a little while ago the one on this show of Ezra doing his like Marg Delahunty bit, where it was like Ezra in drag, which was like fantastic. This one though I had forgotten about. Let's take a look.
I shall now commit the most heinous crime imaginable to Earth worshippers. They're pretty soft on real crimes, against people. But Saint Suzuki himself has called for politicians to be jailed for not believing in his theory of man-made global warming. Well, Suzuki's going to give me the death penalty for this. I shall now commit first-degree lumberjacking on this poor tree. Happy Earth Day, Sam. Fire up the chainsaw.
How he survived that, I will not know, because it doesn't look like he had ever touched one of those things before, and I haven't asked Ezra. I suspect has never done it since either.
He just doesn't seem like the type, which is why it was smart the producer got it started for him. But He did a thorough job. That poor little cedar head didn't do anything to Ezra. But you see how he got right down there in the roots? I don't know if that thing bounced back.
Yeah, he made David Suzuki cry there for sure. Any Earth Day plans on your part, Kris?
No, it's business as usual here in Alberta, producing energy for the rest of the country as best we can and trying to export it as best we can, which I will remind people again. Let's just, for seriousness here, if global emissions are your key issue, say they keep you up at night, they get you up in the morning, they really bother you, we can work on the big end of the arithmetic problem, folks. We can actually ship things like our natural gas, which is much cleaner burning fuel, to places like India to replace their coal and their wood and their animal dung that they burn indoors every single day. So if you want to actually tackle global emissions, let's work on the big end of the arithmetic problem. And that includes places like Alberta.
Well, and also inefficient forms of fuel over the years, like going back to the 19th century, have never been phased out or combated by regulation, but rather by innovation. And this is the one thing that the federal government refuses to acknowledge.
Yes, I'm really glad you brought this up. Can I talk about horse manure on your show? Is that allowed?
Absolutely.
Okay.
It'll become a CBC broadcast when you spew too much of the manure, though.
This will become a heritage moment. So for folks who aren't huge history nerds, I heartily encourage you to pick up a book from the last turn of the last century. So in the late 1800s, okay? Go look up the Great Horse Manure Crisis. And I'm bringing this up for a real reason, okay? Think pre-automobile. Okay. People were still getting their stuff to the store. They were still getting to school. They still had to get to work. People were still transporting themselves and goods, especially in big cities like New York City and London over in the United Kingdom. How did they get to places? How did they ship their goods? By horse and cart. Now, horses were our main source of transportation, but their emissions were something real. Not joking. So at one point in places like New York City, world-class cities, and London, okay, we had piles and piles of horse manure that was so bad, Andrew, that people couldn't get through it. There were actually jobs of men that would get out there with a shovel to shovel a tunnel for somebody to even get across the street. Now, just imagine the flies. Just imagine the parasites and the disease. Add to that actual horse carcasses. So this is for real, folks. You can look it up in the New York Times. They had a summit about this. But you know what saved them? It was innovation. The government did not suddenly grow a new arm and start trying to ban things or tax things to death because they didn't know what to do. But problems are the mother of innovation, okay? A crisis is the mother of innovation, and government is not the solution. What happened is human beings invented the internal combustion engine, and they went to horseless cars. Car, by the way, is short for carriage, okay? That's why it's called a dashboard, because it was literally a board that kept all the mud and stuff from flying up when the horse was dashing in front of you. So this is linear, folks, and we have been able to solve transportation emission crises in the past without resorting to impoverishing people for the sin of driving to work and heating their home.
I just stopped listening when you said car was short for carriage. I never knew that. I'll say it to the smartest person in the room. Will I look foolish, or are you confident about that?
I'm 100% confident. No, that's why it's called a glove box too. Because they literally kept their driving gloves that you're driving a horse, right?
Okay.
Why do we call it driving? Why do we call it horsepower in the engine? It's actually all related. It's pretty fascinating. And so the glove box was literally where the driver would keep his or her gloves. So that way you don't get chaps from the reins.
Yeah, now they just call it the insurance slip-in driver's manual box. All right, I did not know that. I learned so much from you, Kris. This is why we're glad to have you back every Monday. We will talk to you next week. Kris Sims from the Canadian Taxpayers Federation. Always a pleasure.
Likewise.
All right. I trust Kris. I'm gonna fact check that. Hang on. Let me do this right now. I want to make sure. Yep. No, she's actually, hang on. Do we have Kris? If we still have Kris, let's put her back on here. Okay. The English word car is believed to originate from the Latin carum, which, okay, this one says chariot that it comes from, but yours makes more sense.
Yeah, well, it would have gone. So I'm not an etymologist.
Okay.
My husband is. So.
Oh yeah, he's a good one too.
If I'm delving into this, so it would have gone chariot to carriage to car. It all.
Okay, no, yeah, it originally referred to any wheeled horse-drawn vehicle such as a cart, carriage, or wagon. So I guess it could have been cart or carriage, depending on which evolutionary path it took. All right. Well, you're our in-house etymologist now. Step aside, Harley. We got Kris showing up here. All right. Thanks for coming back on.
Bye.
Thanks for listening to The Andrew Lawton Show. Support the program by donating to True North at www.tnc.news.